I'm Stephen Wells, the host of the Reborn Motoring Weekly podcast, focusing primarily on the Australian historic road and racing community. In this episode, I'm discussing an evolution of the internal combustion engine that powers the majority of historic vehicles. Granted that there are still some very old steam and electric vehicles that are over 100 years old still being used today. The four-stroke internal combustion engine as we know it was originally developed back in the 1880s in Europe by engineers looking to find ways to replace the steam engine as a power source for small businesses. The patent, though, goes back 20 years earlier to the 1860s, when a French engineer, Alphonse Beau de Rochas, got the paperwork in. However, two Italian engineers had claimed that they had developed one back in the 1850s. In the 1880s, the engineer Nicholas Otto actually built a working version, which became an industry standard and is why many engines use the Otto cycle, a four-stroke motor, being one, the induction of gas, a mixture of fuel and air, then compression, then power through ignition, and finally an exhaust stroke. The cycle therefore produces power once in 4 strokes of the piston and 2 rotations of the crankshaft. And at the same time that Otto was working on his motor, a 2-stroke motor was developed that produces power every 2 strokes of the piston and 1 rotation of the crankshaft. 2 strokes were used in small machines, outboard motors, motorcycles and mopeds, as well as larger machines that required a good power-to-weight dynamic. They were also the basis of the motors that Rudolf Diesel was working on that became modern diesel engines. In the early 20th century, a British engineer, James Atkinson, developed a motor with a novel approach. The piston travelled further for power than it did for the exhaust. This meant that for every 4-stroke cycle, the crankshaft turned once instead of twice. Toyota used a version of the Atkinson cycle in some of their hybrid motors to improve the efficiency of their engine. And Toyota have always felt that a hybrid motor is a better way forward than a pure electric one. Over the last 140 years, the 4-stroke internal combustion engine has been developed extensively with new materials, fuel injection, turbochargers, superchargers, and variable valve timing, to list a few enhancements. Smaller 2-stroke motors have waned in popularity mainly due to emissions control. 2 strokes mix a little oil with the fuel on intake, which then produces a dirtier exhaust. Government policies have effectively outlawed them for consumer use. And in recent years, after the VW Group scandal with their fake emission test results, even diesel motors have gone out of fashion, despite diesel being cheaper in many countries. So on to today. In the last week, there have been reports that Porsche has patented a 6-stroke motor in the US. The idea appears to find a balance between the 2- and 4-stroke motors and uses some ideas from the Atkinson motor. In effect, it has a power stroke twice in 6 strokes, not exactly as many reported as being explicitly every 3rd stroke. The patented design, which doesn't yet appear to have been built, is to have the following cycle: 1 induction of fuel and air, 2 compression, 3 power through ignition, 4 a second compression, 5 a second ignition and power stroke, and then 6 the exhaust stroke. This burns more of the fuel, and in a high-performance motor, not all the fuel air is fully burned in the power stroke, especially if the motor is spinning at high revs, so this design ignites any remaining fuel. In the patent, Porsche describes the motor as having 6 distinct strokes mapped into 2 3-stroke sequences, so induction compression power followed by compression power exhaust. To achieve this, Porsche use one of the concepts in the Atkinson cycle, which is that the length of the stroke is different based on where in the cycle the piston and connecting rod are. Porsche's crankshaft design connects the conrod to a cogwheel that rotates inside a toothed housing that changes the length of the stroke as it goes through the 6-stroke cycle. Clearly, the second power stroke is going to be much less powerful than the first, due to less fuel to burn, and I would think that they may have to inject a small amount of air into that second compression to help make that burn more efficient in its own right. Porsche suggests that their new design improves the efficiency of the fuel burnt, producing cleaner emissions. And I think that's a good thing, and perhaps it could be used with a biofuel as well. It might be that a 6-stroke motor is required for newer fuels simply due to the efficiency of the fuel. Personally, I don't think the internal combustion engine is dead yet. I am very much in favour of the market sorting itself out and not having governments dictate what we buy through taxes. In the last century, it has been governments that have encouraged consumers to buy firstly petrol and then diesel-powered cars, with climate and health issues coming later with those options. Lead has been removed from fuels, and diesel cars are now much cleaner. Taxation policy has certainly affected what is being sold by the manufacturers. We are now into a period where governments want to ban petrol and diesel cars, and they favour electric without considering the damage they have done in the past by sending buyers down a path that often ends badly. Developments like the 6-stroke motor by Porsche can only be a good thing, as it means choice for the consumer and a cleaner environment. Well, that's all for this week. There'll be more next week. I'm working on some great interviews with car clubs and owners, so subscribe through your favourite podcast player and get the episodes delivered as they drop. I'm Stephen Wells, and you've listened to Motoring Weekly, the podcast for the Australian historic road and racing community.